everyone. Today, Kibby and I are going to be talking about empathy. Empathy is something that's gaining a lot of interest lately because the world has a huge lack of it. This can be really difficult in relationships when you feel like there's a barrier or breakdown of empathy, like a person can't understand you or vice versa. It can make mental illness issues so much harder because there's a lack of connection and understanding to what you're going through. We're really excited about this episode as well because this is actually Kibby's main research interest. We're going to go ahead, talk about what empathy is, what empathy isn't, summarize what she's learned, and give some tips and skills for how to increase empathy in your own life and react to somebody empathically. I also got some accounts from my followers on Instagram about their descriptions of what it's been like to have grown up in a family where there was a lack of empathy, where they were experiencing a lot of invalidation around their thoughts, their feelings, and their own mental health struggles. So thank you to everyone who responded to me, and I'm going to read 2 stories, so thank you so much for letting me into your lives a little bit. So Kibby, first of all, what is empathy?
Yeah, thank you for that question, just because empathy is thrown around a lot, especially in the news and books and in common language. And I think that we think of it as one way, like being nice to people or being understanding but it's not, empathy is not just one thing. In the literature, actually, empathy is like a set of abilities to perceive, understand, and respond to other people's emotions. So it's a whole set of psychological processes and abilities and skills, I would say, to be able to like respond to other people's emotions, like how you take it in, how do you understand what people are thinking and feeling, understanding why they're thinking and feeling that way, and responding in a way that is resonant with that. So that's what empathy is, and that's what we understand it from the literature and the research.
Do you think there are misunderstandings around what empathy is and what it isn't?
Yeah, I think the most, when people say, oh, that person's empathetic, or I'm really highly empathetic or not, people think about just being nice to others, right? To be like kind and altruistic, which is one part of empathy. But there's a lot of people who are very empathetic, and what they do is that they just like perceive and take in other people's emotions really strongly. And they might not be good at responding well, right? They might actually like freeze up. They don't know what to do with it. It could be overwhelming. They might shut down because there's just like too many emotions. So actually, people with high empathy tend to sometimes look like they're not empathetic because we just expect it to look like a certain thing, like someone who's just very magnanimous, but that might not be the whole story.
The other thing is someone who really seems not empathic or not nice might be really empathic, but it's because there's different kinds of empathy, right? So
right.
Someone like a narcissist or someone with antisocial personality disorder, are there kinds of empathy that they're strong, like that they're higher in or lower in? Because we often say like narcissists have no empathy, but I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah. No, I love that question because I just spent my entire PhD. PhDs are so fun because you just spend like 6 years immersing yourself in one tiny question, which for me at first, I'm so interested in so many things that it was a little overwhelming, but I just really delved into what empathy is, and I realized there's like these different levels of empathy. So right now in the research, what they say is there's cognitive empathy, there's affective empathy, and compassion or altruism. So with affective empathy, I'll just call it emotional empathy. With emotional empathy, that's just the ability to pick up on other people's emotions. Just there's some people who are super hot, like highly sensitive to other people's emotions. You're the kind of person, you're high in emotional empathy. If you walk in a room and someone is upset and you like just feel upset really quickly, right? Or if your friend is crying, you can't help but like feel it yourself. Like that's high emotional empathy. It's kind of like this, it's also called emotion contagion. And they say that's like the most basic type of empathy. If you look at like animals or babies, like if one bird gets scared and flies away, you see the whole flock fly away. If one baby cries in a nursery, they all cry, right? Because like people and other animals are used to passing along that signal of emotion right? And it's very useful, right? If someone's scared because they saw danger in the environment, the rest of the birds will fly away, right? So this emotional empathy is just like this quick picking up on other people's emotions in a way that you might feel that way yourself. So that's emotional empathy. And then cognitive empathy, which is really cool. It's like this higher level of being able to understand what other people are feeling. So you might be really, really good at picking up on someone's emotions and saying, well, Jacqueline looks pretty sad today because I know that she went through something hard today and blah, blah, blah. But if someone's really bad at cognitive empathy, they have trouble understanding like why someone else will feel the way that they do. Sometimes it's called perspective taking. Like some people, you could see someone else being upset and either get it and understand why that person's upset, or you could be like, I don't know why that person's upset. That's silly. I don't get it. So there's those two levels, like the just pure picking up on someone's emotions on a very visceral, primal level. And then there's like this understanding of why they're feeling the way they're feeling.
Yeah, and both of these types of empathy they're neurologically separate. So affect empathy is ruled by the limbic system, which is kind of the emotional center of the brain. And then cognitive empathy is literally cognitive. It's ruled by the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
So it's thinking our way into another person's experience.
Exactly. No, I love that.
How does it work if someone has high cognitive empathy but low affect empathy? Are they remembering their own experiences?
No, that's an awesome segue because there's also, I mean, I think in grad school, it's just trying to understand all these different pieces of empathy. And I realized that in the literature, there's some people who are really good at one and might be bad at the other and vice versa, right? So people who have high emotional empathy can pick up on other people's emotions. But if they're bad at cognitive empathy, they're going to feel this intense distress, but then be like, what's happening? Mm-hmm. They don't have the ability to say, oh, like Jacqueline's having a hard time. I'm picking up on that and I'm feeling it really intensely, but it's her emotion, so I'm going to comfort her. They go, oh, everyone's upset, right? Or just feel really bad and I don't know why. And vice versa. Some people don't pick up on emotional empathy, but cognitively they're like, okay, I'm looking at the room. I see that, I know that Jacqueline's talking about this story and I know that she's probably feeling sad. So XYZs, right? So you could have like differing abilities in these different parts of empathy.
Okay.
What was your original question? I'm sorry.
Well, my original question was just when someone has cognitive empathy but low affect empathy, is it that they really can't emotionally experience another person's, or is it that they are down-regulating it so much? Because I would think if you have high cognitive empathy, you've either experienced others' emotions before, or you're thinking back to the times when you've experienced similar emotions and applying that.
As we're talking about this, these different empathy deficits can appear in different kinds of psychopathology. And so part of me is just trying to figure out like who is good in what and bad in what. But
borderline personality disorder has high affect empathy and lower cognitive empathy, right? I mean, that's...
Exactly. So people who have BPD, borderline personality disorder, as we talked about in actually our BPD episode, they are emotionally sensitive. Mm-hmm. And so most likely they actually can pick up on other people's emotions, but they don't have the regulation and the skills to be able to understand it in a way that's healthy for them. Either they kind of default to this, everyone hates me and they're rejecting me, or they just don't understand what's happening, and so they just are overwhelmed by picking up on people's emotions as well as their own. So that's what it could look like when it's just high emotional empathy and low cognitive empathy.
I was reading the research on this, and I found a paper that was describing the 3 neural processes involved in empathy. The first was emotion simulation, which again is a limbic process. So that's literally experiencing someone else's emotion. The second one was perspective taking, which is prefrontal. So the sort of headquarters of your brain. And then the third was actually emotion regulation. So it was the ability to down-regulate your own affective response to another's so that you can help extend compassion. And so what might be happening is that the person with BPD is maybe even good at the first two, maybe is good at perspective taking, but isn't that emotion regulation process isn't kicking in, and so they're unable kind of to... Is that what's going on, or is it that there's deficits in perspective taking?
Yeah, no, I love that because that's so great. Because my next question in grad school was like, okay, what is empathy? But then what gets in the way of empathy? Your question is perfect because it's like, there's some people who are not very good at empathy, but why is it? Do they not have the ability? Do they not care? Does something get in the way? And my whole dissertation looked at, my whole graduate work looked at that one thing that get in the way is having intense emotions yourself. So if you're super upset, what tends to happen is that, first of all, you really pull your attention to yourself and like, how do I survive this situation? And also you tend to read the situations and interactions in a way that's like, that's in line with what you're feeling in the moment. So you're feeling bad, you're going to look at all the situations as rejecting and things like that. You're not going to really be there for the other person. And so my whole dissertation looked at does regulating your own emotion, like using a mindful breathing skill to calm down, does that help you be empathetic towards other people? And the answer is yes. And I'll talk a little bit about like what skill to use to help you with that. So with people with BPD, they might be experiencing such intense emotions that they actually cannot sit and think like, oh, okay, what is Jacqueline feeling right now? And with the different populations, like people who have trauma or people who have some other kind of personality disorders like antisocial or narcissistic, the research shows that they might be a little bit worse at some emotional empathy. Like they're not very good at picking up on other people's fear or distress. And it's still unclear why. That's a really interesting gap in the literature. Like why is it just they're born unable to? My guess is that people with trauma and antisocial personality disorder and those kind of populations have experienced some kind of abuse themselves. And they might have some kind of reason to shut down their own emotions, right? They're just not connected to it. They don't want it. It's threatening and scary to think about fear. So they even block their own emotions about that and block when they pick up on other people's. And so they might be blunted in that way, but they might have developed the ability to understand other people's emotions for survival. And that might be why there's that difference in the two different skills.
That's so interesting. So you think it might be a form of emotional suppression that then develops actually like a neural correlate? So, I mean, we literally see things like the amygdala is not as activated when looking at fearful faces for people with antisocial personality disorder. Yeah. But you think that was an active suppressive process in their...
I think that's a hypothesis that definitely should be... I mean, I think that, yes, we've seen with especially people who have trauma that there's a lot of emotional suppression, a lot of emotional avoidance, right? Their own vulnerable emotions are very scary to deal with. And when emotional empathy, you're picking up on some people's emotions and you feel it a little bit yourself. So if someone's dampening their own emotions, they're going to dampen that emotion when they pick up on you when you're feeling that emotion. So it's definitely a hypothesis, and there's some literature to show that, but we don't fully know. We don't know if there's some people out there who are born without the ability to read other people's emotions, like at all.
Yeah, I want a longitudinal study. Look at babies, toddlers of antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder. That's so cool. Yeah, it's really cool. This is this kind of stuff that I was geeking out over the past couple of years. Like, why? Why are some people so good at being there and being empathetic and listening and caring, and some people they look like they don't even care, or they blank out, or they walk away, or say something mean when someone's upset, right? It's a really cool question for me. Yeah, I mean, I also do want to add that there's another piece of empathy that is just compassion. This is what we say in the research is compassion is a warm, loving, and caring response to when someone else feels like a vulnerable, negative emotion. That's what most people think empathy is. When someone is able to like hug or support or care when someone else is in distress, and we're like, oh, that person's so empathetic. Well, that's like the last piece of empathy, which is ideally if you pick up on someone being sad, you understand why they're sad, and give them that support, which is like compassion. That is what that whole cascade of behaviors is what we would consider like a true empathetic response. But something that I found really interesting was like some people who are overwhelmed with empathy, right? Like right now, sometimes like hearing all of the really hard things that are happening in the world, other people suffering, other people hurting, that actually could lead to a lot of empathy burnout. Like it's just too much to take in.
And people tend to be not empathetic. They tend to turn away. The researchers Matthew Ricard and Tanya Singer put out a whole set of beautiful research that talks about when that happens, compassion could be a nice solution for that. It's just like to not just take in people's emotions, but to understand that people are feeling distress and then really focus on the extending compassion for them. It's kind of a hard thing, but that's a tip for people who are empaths, who are very highly empathetic and get overwhelmed with the empathy burnout, is like to focus on being compassionate. Something else I realized, I was digging through the literature to really understand, okay, who is bad at empathy and why? Like, is it just specific types of people, disorders, or whatever? And what I found is actually there's a lot. Like, probably most psychiatric disorders are also linked with problems with empathy. People who have autism are not very good at a lot of the different parts that we talked about: schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. So this is a real mental health issue because people with mental health struggles tend to not be empathetic. And it most likely that their disorder gets in the way of empathy. And so in this podcast, when we talk about, you're having loved ones with mental health issues, most likely those people tend to not be as empathetic as you need them to be to your own struggles. And then that could go back and forth where you feel like, well, that person doesn't care about my emotions. Like, why should I care about their struggles? So there's a real breakdown there in psychopathology and relationships.
So I put out a question asking followers if they had had experiences growing up in unempathetic households. So this person responded, "I did. As a Black child with ADHD and a narcissistic father, it was really hard because mental health is often invalidated in the Black community. My ADHD diagnosis was ignored, which created a lot of anxiety and an endless cycle of those symptoms and depression because of the invalidation." So then she says, "I always had a hard time performing well in school, which was the opposite expectation my dad had for his kids. My sister, on the other hand, always had straight A's and did very well. I spent a lot of my school days anxious about how my dad would react about my grades, because I would always end up being called lazy or told things like, only dumb people get D's. When my dad was disappointed in my academic performance, he would pretend I didn't exist, or if he did acknowledge me, he would question why I couldn't do as well as my sister, even though my various diagnoses literally answered these questions. He refused to believe that these were mental health issues, especially since he was convinced that his behavior was justified and would force me to succeed, when in reality, a big part of my anxiety and depression stems from this, and I still struggle with the constant invalidation of my very real issues."
I mean, thank you for that. That's a really, really good example of an empathy breakdown and how damaging that could be for someone with mental health, right? And to start out, our definition of validation is treating someone else's inner experiences, like emotions, thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors, as real or valid. We focus on emotional validation, like validating someone else's emotions as valid. So what I heard from that is that she was struggling to do well in school, and a lot of that was her due to a lot of struggles with mental health, with ADHD and things like that. And the father was not understanding, not being empathetic about what she was going through. That's a really good example of, let's say, a cognitive empathy deficit, where he could have picked up that she was struggling or was distressed or unhappy or not motivated, but he didn't know why. He couldn't understand and take her perspective and really understand what is the source of why she was struggling. And that could be so hard, right? Because it's such a part of human experience is to share realities and to be understood, right? To understand our inner experiences and the way that we see the world, and to have just someone else sit in that with us, right? To be like, oh, I get it. I understand what you're feeling and going through. That is huge, right? We like pine for that. And to not get that for someone that that your parents or someone that you care about so deeply can be, especially if you're struggling with something serious like ADHD or something else, it could be devastating.
Yeah. I also thought it was interesting she brought in the idea that mental health is invalidated in Black communities. I also say that Black mental health is often invalidated in white communities as well.
Yeah, no, I think that another beautiful layer to that story is like the systemic invalidation and the systemic lack of empathy that's really coming up a lot these days, where there is, when we talk about validation, treating other people's inner experiences as real, a lot of people from minority groups, Black, Hispanic, Asian, like myself included, they might have a chronic feeling that other people's society is not really understanding and listening to their emotions or experiences and treating them as real. That's happening a lot in medicine, and there's a lot in mental health where people from those communities will come in to get mental health and they say, I'm in pain, I'm struggling, I'm unhappy. And, even well-meaning doctors or well-meaning medical providers would kind of downplay it or invalidate it. So, I mean, empathy can be like on an individual level, like whether Jacqueline, you're understanding my emotions, vice versa, or it could be systemic where if you're interacting with teachers, doctors, policemen, having that empathy is, and having a breakdown of empathy could really increase mental health issues. Yeah.
Yeah. It's also the case that in certain cultures, mental health is not considered as valid as other forms of ailment. And one thing that's been discovered is that a lot of these communities, I think Black, Asian, and Hispanic in particular, often experience their anxiety and distress somatically. So they have a lot of physical symptoms, maybe less crying, less rumination. They might not even say, I'm upset, I'm depressed, I'm anxious. It might be more, my back has been really tense, I've been having headaches, I'm not sleeping, mouth is dry. So as therapists, I know we try to attune also to physical symptoms, because there might be kind of a cultural divide that way.
Right, because as I said, it's so powerful and human to want someone else to understand and be with our own experience. So if I tell you I'm in pain and you're like, no, you're not, you're fine, I'm going to try to communicate it in a way where you do, like my whole body's aching, right? And then you'll be like, oh my gosh. And so we do try to pull for empathetic responses in the world around us, which is it's very natural.
So this person says, my father took everything I said very personally. Telling him that I was sad would always result in him getting very emotional and feeling bad about himself. My mom would pretend like I didn't say anything. It taught me to keep my feelings to myself and try to deal with everything on my own. Ultimately, I've had to learn how to trust people with my feelings. I've internalized the message that people either can't handle my emotions or are disinterested and don't want to know them. It also fostered an over-identification with my emotions. I grew very adept at hiding them and remaining stoic while simultaneously obsessing about them internally. Ultimately, the lack of attention my feelings received in childhood led to a need to pay them an undue amount of attention through constant introspection. I could see how others may have a different response to my situation. For example, my brother is very unemotional and does not view his emotions as important. He is hyperlogical and avoids vulnerability. When I told my mom I was suicidal in high school and wanted to go to therapy, she just dismissed the conversation by saying, all right, we can look into that. But then there was no more talk of what the next steps were and the topic was never revisited. My dad, on the other hand, had a breakdown crying when I told him and made it about how he's a bad father and left for hours to go on a drive alone. Ultimately, it just resulted in a huge emotional fight with him and I. I will also say that despite this, they are wonderful parents who love me a lot. That's why it was so paradoxical sometimes how they reacted to my negative emotions.
Thank you for the people who brought that. Those are really great examples of how empathy deficits or empathy breakdowns, whatever you want to call them, can look very differently. But it have such devastating effects on the person who's not being empathized with, right? So in the one that you just shared, that dad sounded to me like someone with a very high emotional empathy, got very distressed in the response, like he really picked up on the daughter's emotions really, really intensely, but didn't know how to regulate and cope with it himself. So the levels of like cognitive and maybe compassion, he wasn't able to reach that because maybe he was just overwhelmed with sadness himself, which could look really unempathetic. Like, actually, it's super high, but he's unable to cope with that very well. Might be an empath in some way.
Well, it's interesting. He turned it into a shame response, too.
Right. It's like, it's one thing to be able to pick up some of the other people's emotions. It's another to know what to do with them. Right? Like someone who's trained and someone who is able to accept and be compassionate to their own emotions might be able to do the same to when they pick up on like their son or daughter's emotions. But someone who's, ashamed of their own emotions or get overwhelmed, they don't know how to handle it when they, have that emotional contagion. So that's a really sad, because then what happens is sometimes it's like with that other person who had the original feeling to begin with has to be in the role of taking care of them.
Yeah. I also appreciated how she ended this by saying that her parents are wonderful people. I think it's important to remember, I mean, so much of pathology can have its origins in our childhood, in our relationships with our parents. And again, it's important to remember that a lot of times people are doing their best, but we all have deficits. We all make mistakes. And
I think this is a really important point that you bring up, because a lot of people who have mental health, like depression, like a low self-esteem, problems dealing with their own emotions in adulthood, sometimes wonder why, because they look back and say, my parents were loving, I had a great upbringing, I had no trauma, I don't get it, why I struggle so much. Often it's because of these empathy deficits, because if their parents are not able to respond and be compassionate towards their kids' emotions, they could feel like horrible, right? They're given messages that their own emotions are wrong. They make their parents upset. And it could be these little interactions like the one you just read. These little like, oh, the kid cried and the parents, invalidated them, shut down, got upset themselves, didn't react emotionally. That over time will lead to a really, really damaging sense of self. Like when I have emotions, it's wrong. I'm wrong. I must be wrong. I must be the problem. And that can really affect the way they see themselves. So sometimes a lot of struggles in adulthood are because of these like really persistent, very subtle empathy deficits.
I thought it was interesting also the different reactions that she and her brother now have to emotions. He learned that his emotions aren't important. She actually learned that they're very important. Mm-hmm. It's just that other people can't accept them or help her with them. So she learned, my emotions are so important, but I have to keep them inside. And now she ruminates, she obsesses, she thinks about her internal experience all the time, but she can't let it out. She can't share it with others and can't in turn get that validation and empathy.
It actually sounds like how I grew up. I mean, like, I love my mom. I've talked about in previous episodes about her struggle with alcoholism, and she was struggling with her emotions so much that when I would have any kind of emotions, like as a teenager or adolescent, and I would be upset, she would quickly go into, well, I'm upset, I'm even more upset, and then she had to like cope in her own way, and left me really alone with my emotions. Felt really invalidated and almost kind of punished for having an emotion. So I've learned to kind of like deal with my own emotions, and it makes it very hard for me to open up to other people, be vulnerable, ask for help. I mean, you've mentioned this to me before.
Yes, I'm aware of this.
I'm sorry. I'm work in progress.
It's not sorry. It's just, well, for you all, Kibby will spin her wheels and she'll be thinking about things and she'll kind of tie herself into a knot and then she'll kind of suggest that and then she'll be like, but how are you? Let's talk about you. And I'm like, no, let's talk about you. And it'll be back and forth with her giving another little crumb and then trying to turn it back on me. I'm like, nope.
Oh, I'm feeling shame right now. Why?
No, she's feeling shame.
Well, that's like a really good example of how I'm a product of chronic invalidation and empathy deficit. And of course, my mom is great. She means well. I grew up in a great.
Love Mama Karen.
We're gonna have her on the podcast soon. She's gonna be excellent. But yeah, I mean, it caused a lot of issues in my own life, and yeah, I could trace it back to like just hundreds and hundreds of little interactions like that where I had emotion and she didn't react with empathy. Yeah, I really like to talk about empathy as a set of skills, right? A set of abilities and skills that we can be born better at or worse at, but this is something that we could work on and get better at. So a couple ways to improve empathy, and it really depends on what gets in the way. I'll talk about two. One is dealing with your own emotions that could get in the way of empathy, and also not knowing what to say and how to actually express empathy, how to be compassionate and validating. So the first one was the topic of my dissertation is when you're feeling really intense emotions yourself, like even intense happiness, but mostly it's like if you're feeling intense fear, distress, or whatever, it can be really hard to be empathetic to someone else. So if you're feeling really, really upset, what I would say is to practice emotion regulation skills to help yourself calm down first before you address someone and talk to your loved one who is struggling. So, I mean, there could be many different ways that you calm yourself down. You know yourself best, maybe taking a walk, maybe listening to a podcast, maybe listening to music, talking to a friend. Anything that helps you kind of bring your emotional intensity down to a level where you can really listen and be outwardly focused. In my dissertation, I taught a mindful breathing skill, which is simply paying attention to your breath and taking a few minutes to breathe in for a shorter amount of time than breathing out. So I taught that it's breathing in for a count of 4 and out for a count of 7. Mm-hmm. So if you do that for at least 30 seconds, longer the better, you could bring your emotional intensity down right before you go into interacting with someone who you're going to need your empathy reserves for, right? So that's one tip. And the other one is just in dialectical behavior therapy, we talk a lot about validation. Again, which is to treating someone else's emotions and other internal experiences as valid and real. So they have a really nice breakdown of this as a skill, and there's different levels of it. But at the core, what it is really fully listening, like listening to the other people, what they're saying about their emotion. And then reflecting it back, like even using their words, like, oh, I see that you're very upset. I understand that you're freaked out. And then communicating that their emotion makes sense, mm-hmm. or that you're understanding it in some way, which could literally be the words, I understand you're feeling upset, and that makes sense. Usually it's like, that makes sense given that you're going through X, Y, Z, that you're going through a hard time, that you know, whatever. So it's literally saying like, I see that you're feeling this and it makes sense. So emotional empathy, I'm picking up on the emotion, and cognitive empathy, I understand why. And you don't have to approve. You don't have to be like, well, you're really mad at me and I don't agree with why you're mad at me. So you don't have to like approve, and you don't have to agree with exactly the way they're seeing the situation, but you can at least treat their emotions as real, right? Mm-hmm. So I think the difference is that a validation does not necessarily mean you agree 100%, but it could be like, I have an emotion and I have a response to this, and I get that you have one, and yours is just as valid as mine.
Yeah, because it is. I mean, that's the difference between agreeing and recognizing, I mean, they do have an emotional experience, and it is happening and it is real. And so all validation is acknowledging that, and then taking the extra step to try to understand it and communicate that to them. And I think, the simplest level is, yeah, that makes sense. I get it. I see that you're upset. I think sometimes you can expand on it with putting it into your own words. I don't know. In therapy, I use a lot of metaphor and imagery. I remember once I was talking to you about my angst around The Bachelor and how my airtime had been cut. And I know this is something that it's been very difficult for other people to empathize with me about, because other people see it as, you had an awesome experience, be grateful for what you had. And I remember one really empathic response you gave me was, I was thinking about how terrible it would be to get your hopes up and dream about all these new possibilities and then be left on the cutting room floor. And I think even that image of the cutting room floor was like really evocative for me. And it was like, she gets it. Okay. And then that kind of allowed us to move through the conversation and move on to other things, because I knew that you had been able to kind of create this image of what I was going through.
Aw, yeah. Sweet. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, in essence, it's just like sharing that person's experience, right? However you communicate it, you could say, it makes sense, or you could put in your own words to be like, yeah, wow, that must be hard. Yeah. From your perspective.
And the thing about it is that until that happens, what will often happen is the person who's in distress will spend so much time trying to get you to get it, because they don't feel like they can move on or talk about anything else or kind of find solutions or conflict resolution until their experience has been understood. So that's when you often get in these circular conversations of, no, but also this, or you're not getting, like, you're not understanding this, and then you can kind of tie yourself into a knot and not move through the conversation. So I think validation showing that you understand what the other person is saying can help you kind of get to a next level.
Yeah, and actually in terms of, dealing with your loved ones with mental health issues, validation is the only skill that we know in research that if you validate someone's emotions, that's the only skill we know to help calm someone else's emotions down, right? It's actually the only emotion you can use to regulate someone else's emotions. There's actually research to show that if I validate your experience, your emotional intensity goes down. If I invalidate it, it goes up. So you're going to be even more upset if I invalidate it, but you're going to feel better if I do validate it. And I think I like the image of that we humans don't like to do things alone, or we don't know how to, we survive in groups. We survive with social support. That is the cornerstone of how our species became as powerful as we are, through being together. And there's a lot of cool research to show that, for example, if you have someone look at a hill and you say, hey, how steep is that hill? You're going to walk up that hill. How steep is that hill? They go, oh, very steep. But if you just put someone next to them and tell them that you're going to walk up it together and you say, how steep is that hill? They're like, oh, not that steep.
That's amazing.
Isn't that cool? So even it just changes your perception. So even just having someone else share in your experience and look at those struggles together with you can really make the struggles feel even less burdensome and challenging than before. So if you have a loved one with mental health illness, they're depressed, they're anxious, they have substance abuse issues, you don't need to exactly know, why they're feeling the way they're feeling or what they're doing, why, especially with a lot of the things they might do in response, like they're not getting out of bed, and you're like, why wouldn't they do that? But even just validating the response and saying, okay, you're feeling so unmotivated. I completely, given that you went through the pandemic and had these other life stressors, I totally get why you would feel this way and why getting up out of bed would be so hard. That would be a validating response in DBT. An invalidating response would be, I don't get it. Why don't you just get up? Yeah. It's so easy. I just got up this morning. Why don't you get up? Right. So even that could have a huge effect on your loved one's distress.
Yeah, I think a lot of people with mental health struggles feel like they don't deserve to feel the way they do, or they're confused about the way they do, and just hearing it mirrored back to them in a way that makes sense can just help clarify what they're going through, and it can help relieve the burden of, well, I shouldn't feel this way. Like, this is stupid. I'm just being crazy or irrational or whatever. And so empathy has the power to validate what they're going through and that they deserve to be going through it.
And to add on to increasing your empathy, I know it could be very hard, especially when you're dealing with a loved one with mental health issues, because that could be really difficult you could also feel kind of tapped out, really exhausted on your own. I just want to make it the point that having empathy and validating someone else's emotions doesn't necessarily mean you have to let go of all of your boundaries or limits or self-care. Yeah. So that's a powerful part of validation, the way we described it. I can say to you, Jacqueline, I get that you're feeling really distressed. It totally makes sense. And when you're yelling at me, it really hurts my feelings, so I'm going to have to take a break, right? So I think that some people will swing towards, oh, I'm being loving and caring and empathetic and totally giving, versus like, I'm out of here and I'm going to be mean and harsh and have my own space. You could use the validation skill plus set your limits.
Yeah, validation isn't a one-way street. You can validate, which then allows you to then validate yourself. So in a conflict, you can validate the other person, which then opens the door for them to be receptive to your own needs. So I think, I had a question from a follower, what's the line between empathy and enabling? And I think it's when your own needs get lost. You forget that you deserve validation and empathy as well.
And when you think that being empathetic means doing certain things, like if I'm being empathetic towards a family member who has substance abuse issues, I might think like, oh, I'm being empathetic. They've had such a hard life and such struggles. I'll give them money. I'll support them. No, you could understand and validate what they're going through, but you don't have to give them money. Like that's why I wanted to emphasize that empathy is not just one thing and one way of being a good person or loving or caring, but it's a whole set of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and skills that, you could have the piece of being validating without the letting go, without being enabling.
Okay, thank you all who listened and all who contributed. If you are looking for any resources on empathy, feel free to reach out to us at littlehelpforourfriends@gmail.com. That's missing the A, so it actually makes it sound like we're not giving you much help, but we are. And we will see you next week. Thanks so much. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.